Good afternoon and welcome to everyone. Thank you all for joining us today on our panel titled God on the Ballot, a discussion of Christian nationalism on the eve of the election. This topic of Christian nationalism has become a serious point of contention in the American political landscape very recently. We're here today to try to understand how this phenomenon emerged, what it means, how do we understand it, why it matters, especially today on the eve of our midterm elections, but also for 2024, and then even beyond the American and Christian context. My name is Brandon Vaidyanathan. I'm an associate professor and chair of sociology at the Catholic University of America. Our department is one of the co-sponsors of this event, along with the Institute for Interreligious Study and Dialogue at the Catholic University of America and the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. And I'm especially grateful to them for organizing our event today. Our event is very brief, so I'm going to very quickly introduce our panelists and then hand it over to our moderator. So Dr. Samuel Perry is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Oklahoma. He is among the nation's leading experts on conservative Christianity and American politics, race, sexuality, and families. He's co-authored 2 recent books on Christian nationalism, including the award-winning book, Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States, with Andrew Whitehead, and more recently, The Flag and the Cross with Philip Gorski. He's currently finishing a book about why the scientific study of religion benefits all of society. Dr. Philip S. Gorski is professor of sociology and religious studies at Yale University. He writes on religion and politics in early modern and modern Western Europe and North America from a comparative historical perspective. His current work focuses on the history and politics of white Christian nationalism and American civil religion. His recent books include American Covenant, A History of Civil Religion from the Puritans to the Present, and American Babylon, Democracy and Christianity Before and After Trump, along with The Flag and the Cross with Sam Perry. Dr. Matthew Taylor is the Protestant scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies, where he specializes in evangelical and Pentecostal movements, religious politics in the US, Muslim Christian dialogue, and American Islam. He holds a PhD in religious studies and Muslim-Christian relations from Georgetown University. His first book, A Study of Salafi Muslims in America and Their Similarities with American Evangelicals, will be published with Cambridge University Press in 2023. He's currently writing a second book about the pivotal role that a charismatic Christian movement called the New Apostolic Reformation played in the Christian nationalist ethos of the Capitol riot. Dr. Amir Hussain is chair and professor of theological studies at Loyola Marymount University, the Jesuit University in Los Angeles, where he specializes in the study of Islam, focusing on contemporary Muslim societies in North America. The author or editor of 5 books, he has also written over 60 scholarly articles and book chapters about religion. He is president-elect of the American Academy of Religion. Our moderator for today's event, Kate Kelly Middleton, is a U.S. Navy veteran, PhD candidate, and teaching fellow in religion and culture at the Catholic University of America School of Theology and Religious Studies. She's also a research fellow at the Rumi Forum's Center for Faith, Identity, and Globalization. Her dissertation research is analyzing contemporary US-based problem sets through an applied Muslim Christian comparative theological framework of hope and fear. Kate, I'm going to hand it over to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be able to bring the 4 of you together to discuss this important topic on the eve of the 2022 election. I want to provide a quick programmatic description. Within this panel today, we hope to use Drs. Gorski and Perry's 2022 book, The Flag and the Cross, and their more recent research as a powerful jumping off point, laying out the patterns and red flags that we are seeing through the sociological lens, and then bringing that conversation with Dr. Taylor's research, which takes seriously the theological motivations and key players that are shaping this current form of Christian nationalism. With the opportunity of having Dr. Amir Hussain as our 4th panelist, we hope to first probe and challenge definitions of Christian nationalism versus Christian patriotism, or Muslim patriotism, Sikh patriotism, or Jewish patriotism, etc., and also widen our lens beyond the US-based patterns to consider global patterns of nationalism and faith. Following panelist presentations, there will be a 10-minute follow-up of question and discussion, and then we'll be opening the floor for 15 minutes to questions from the audience. We'll be moderating the chat throughout the presentation and compiling questions, so please place your questions in the chat throughout the presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Gorski and Dr. Perry.
Thank you very much, Kate. So I'd like to begin, Sam, Perry, and my presentation just by briefly addressing two questions that frequently come up when we discuss white Christian nationalism. One objection is it's just a smear, it's not defined. And the second is, what's Christian about it? Is it really Christian at all? As for the first question, it certainly is true that as the term Christian nationalism has begun to circulate in our public conversation, that some people do use it as a smear against conservative Christians, as a way of just capturing a variety of different grab bag of things that they don't like. But that certainly is not true for the scholarly analyses that have been done of Christian nationalism. For example, in The Flag and the Cross, Sam, Perry, and I offer a twofold definition of white Christian nationalism. We begin by defining it as a deep story, and by that we mean a mythological version of American history, which goes something like this. America was founded as a Christian nation. The founders were Orthodox Christians. The founding documents are based on biblical principles. Because of its piety, America was blessed with particular power and prosperity, and it was blessed in this way in order that it could carry out a mission to spread freedom, religion, capitalism around the world. But that mission and those blessings are now endangered by the increasing presence of non-whites, non-Christians, non-native born Americans on American soil. This brings me to the second question, which is, well, what's Christian about this? So neither Sam nor I are theologians, and so we'll leave it to the theologians to decide whether this is really Christian. But one thing I can say for certain is that this deep story draws on a particular understanding of the Christian scriptures. And in fact, it's really, in a sense, a weaving together of three different stories that are sort of teased out of the Bible. And we refer to these in the book as the Promised Land story, the End Time story, and the Racial Curse story. The Promised Land story is the idea that the English colonists who first began settling North America, and by extension, other Euro-Americans, are in some sense the inheritors, the successors of the ancient Israelites, and that North America is their promised land. And that just as in some parts of the Bible, the old Jewish, the Old Testament, Amalekites and others are found to be occupying the land and must be forced out so that the Israelites can seize their inheritance, so too were the early colonists fully justified, indeed divinely required to seize the land and push out the native peoples. The end time story is based on a literalist interpretation of biblical prophecy, particularly in Daniel and Revelation, which imagines a final cataclysmic cosmic battle between the forces of good and evil, natural and supernatural, a battle in which North America may be one of the central sites and in which Americans are certainly always and ever on the side of the good. Finally, the Racial Curse story is the story that provides a theological justification for chattel slavery of African Americans, arguing that the curse of Ham pronounced by Noah was pronounced on Ham's descendants who settled in Africa, and that their blackness is the mark of a curse pronounced by God, a curse which condemned them to eternal servitude. This is a very old story. In the book, we show that it goes all the way back to the late 17th century, to the period when slavery became fully racialized and equated with blackness, and also to a kind of climactic period in the struggles of the New England Puritans against the native peoples. So what, if anything, does the story have to do with our present day situation? I'll leave Sam to elaborate on this point, but let me simply show a couple of ways in which you still see echoes of this. The idea that America is, or the United States is ultimately a country for white people is an echo of the Promised Land narrative. The idea that politics is a Manichaean struggle between the forces of good and evil is an echo of the end time story. And the idea that the United States is a nation above all others is echoed in various forms of American exceptionalism. It's very clear that all of this has echoed right up into the present day and into our present politics. As a sort of segue to Sam, I'll just add that the second way in which we define white Christian nationalism is as a political vision, a vision not about America's past, but about its future, in which we can see a variety of different attitudes and policy preferences tightly correlated with one another. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sam.
All right, thanks so much. So I appreciate Phil's comments, and I think that sets us up really well to have a conversation about how we think about Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism, leading up to the 2022 midterms and going into 2024 presidential race, which will kick off as soon as the midterms are over. It would seem. So I think to have an intelligent conversation about how Christian nationalism is going to impact our current political moment, I think it's best to think of Christian nationalism in three ways. One of these is very old, and two of them are rather new. The old part of this is Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism, as just as Phil described, as both this deep story of America's past and a vision for its future that has been around for a long, long time. It connects racial legacies and ethnocentric legacies and visions of how America was founded, this mythic story that we tell each other, and a vision for how we want America moving forward. Now, we have tried to various ways, not only as sociologists, but political scientists and psychologists are trying to capture what exactly is Christian nationalism. How do we measure it? How do we operationalize this and see how it is associated with various other kinds of attitudes? So when we're thinking about Christian nationalism as an ideology or a political theology, we ask various questions. Now, I think we can talk about this in the Q&A section. It's just people always want to know how many people, how big is this? Is this fringe? Is this the majority? And majorities of what? And I think for our conversation right now, I just want to stress that what we focus on in the book, in The Flag and the Cross, we focus on primarily on the associations, how these kinds of views correspond with various other kinds of attitudes and behaviors, for example. And what we find is white Christian nationalist ideology, subscribing to this kind of belief system or this ideology, this political theology, is strongly associated with things that that we believe are authoritarian, anti-democratic, ethnocentric, for example, extreme xenophobia, a disregard for voter rights, even a desire to suppress votes in some ways, or a disregard for even the potential for voter suppression, or that voter fraud is rampant, the subscription to various kinds of conspiracy theories, a stolen election, COVID vaccine conspiracies, and QAnon. We also find that it is highly associated with patriarchal attitudes and even support for authoritarian violence. And so regardless of, and again, we should have an important conversation about how many and how we measure those kinds of things, how broad a phenomenon this is. I think it's important to emphasize that this ideology is across multiple studies at this point, not only in the discipline of sociology, but across social science disciplines associated with all kinds of authoritarian, anti-democratic views. And I think that informs how we're thinking about like where the election is going tomorrow, and I think the kinds of issues that are on the ballot. The other two things, the ways that we can think about Christian nationalism are actually more recent. That is, Christian nationalism is emerging as a self-contained identity. That is, more and more Americans are openly subscribing to the identity itself. I am a Christian nationalist, openly embracing that. I'm just actually reading a book today that is now a bestseller of sorts, arguing for why why Christians should subscribe to Christian nationalism, why they should identify as Christian nationalists. And this has been going on for the last half a year, but this is something that is now picking up steam. And lastly, something that we're seeing now, and I think since Trump, but this has also reached a fever pitch, is because of this ideology of Christian nationalism and this emergent identity as Christian nationalist, we have a full-blown political strategy that tries to activate both the ideology and the identity, to try to mobilize and merged into a coalition, people who subscribe to this ideology and identity, as how are we as people who want to take back the country, not just for Jesus, but to take back the country for people like us and our kind of political vision. How are we going to make this country ours again? And so I think that is where we are at this political moment, is we are seeing Christian nationalism not only as an activated ideology, but something that is an identity, and it is emerging as a full-blown political strategy to activate all of the above.
Thank you, Dr. Perry. Turning over to Dr. Taylor.
Thank you. I'll say I think I agree with almost everything that Sam and Phil just said, just both in terms of their characterization of American history and of the way that our politics are trending right now. I'm working with a bit of a different data set, though. My focus in my research right now is looking at the Capitol riot itself, and at the religious leaders who helped to inspire, the people who show up in the social media feeds of the Christians who actually were there, and also the type of spirituality that is present there. And one of the things that, if you dig into the data around the Capitol riot, one of the things that you notice is that there was an overwhelming independent charismatic presence there. And let me define both of those terms. So in Protestant terms, independent is a synonym for non-denominational. So these are folks who are not necessarily attached to any Christian denomination. They tend to congregate around these large non-denominational churches, mega churches. They also have their own media, their own kind of entire media sphere that caters to this independent charismatic world. And then charismatic is Christians who are very interested in the supernatural, interested in experiencing the power of God, the Holy Spirit flowing through them. So Pentecostals are charismatic, but most Pentecostals are denominational. So this is this emergent world that's grown up really in the last 50 or 60 years. And it's kind of the Wild West of American Christianity. And I'm particularly focused on a network of leaders within that world called the New Apostolic Reformation. This is a term that's coined by a seminary professor named C. Peter Wagner in the 1990s. He was at Fuller Theological Seminary, which is also actually my alma mater, although he had retired from Fuller before I ever got there. But Wagner had this idea that the church of the 21st century, particularly this independent charismatic world, is going to be governed by a renewed leadership of apostles and prophets, just as the early church was in his interpretation. And so he believed that these new apostles and prophets were going to emerge and were going to lead the church into great revival. And he came to believe that he himself was one of these anointed apostles, and started, after he left, he retired from Fuller in 1999 and started building this great infrastructure of leadership networks and mentoring structures in order to raise up these new generations of apostles and prophets. And there's a striking correlation between the people who got involved in the Trump administration, some of the early endorsers of Donald Trump, the people who populated the evangelical advisory boards that were surrounded Donald Trump, and these apostles and prophets. And then when you look at the Capitol riot, who was in people's feeds? Who were the people at the Capitol riot? Especially the Christians in the surrounding crowds. They're doing spiritual warfare. They're leading worship music. They're singing. It was actually a very ecstatic type of spirituality that surrounded the Capitol riot. And a lot of the leaders who they were looking to were coming out of this New Apostolic Reformation network of leaders. So I think what I appreciate about Sam and Philip's work is they're giving us the big picture numbers and trends. I think we also need to drill down on what are the particular theologies, what are the particular ideologies that undergird this Christian nationalism, and what is at the molten core of the Christian nationalism that we see spreading around. So to just take one instance, there's now a Reawaken America tour that I would say is the beating heart of Christian nationalism in the US right now. And it is largely inspired by these independent charismatic folks. And it is being driven by apostles and prophets who are participating in these, it's somewhere between a religious revival meeting and a political rally. Right. And it's very strong in this election denialism. So I also think it's important that we pay attention to who these leaders are and what their theology is, because that, if you look at some of the data on Christian nationalism as just a broad spectrum, it's a pretty mushy spectrum. It's very hard to pin down exactly what these people are doing. So Pew came out with a study a week and a half ago on Christian nationalism, and they found that 45% of Americans say that America should be a Christian nation, which is a very startling number, right? But then when you actually drill down into their data, because they do follow-up questions to their credit, and they start asking, of those 45%, how many of you think that the US government, the federal government, should declare the US a Christian nation, basically abolish the First Amendment? And only about 30% of those 45% say that they think that the federal government should declare the US a Christian nation, right? So we're really talking about maybe 10 to 15% of the spectrum that has really dyed in the wool hardcore around this idea of Christian nationalism. And then you've got a lot of people with kind of vague sentiments, I think flowing very much out of the trends that Sam and Philip outlined about the Christian values should inform American society, or we're a society of majority Christians, and so therefore Christians should have a stronger voice in our society, right? It's that mushiness that these New Apostolic Reformation folks are in that molten core. And they're in the core of the religious right over the course of the last decade has become much more independent charismatic than it ever has been. And so I think we need to pay attention to the particular leaders, the particular ideas. There's been an explosion of spiritual warfare practices, corporate spiritual warfare practices, this idea of battling against demons, battling against witchcraft in politics, in American politics. Well, that's coming out of that independent charismatic world. And similarly, these ideas of Christians taking over society, that's not kind of a historic mainstream evangelical idea, but it's very much a mainstream independent charismatic idea. And so I think we need to pay, and there's other strands of this, right? Those aren't the only ones. You also have Catholic integralists, which is a much more kind of integrated intellectual vision of kind of Christian nationalism or Christian supremacy. You have very strong strands within American Calvinism, right? What we call Reformed theology that have this much more sharp edge. So I'll throw out a point, and I'm curious to hear input from others. But I'm increasingly moving towards. I think we can keep this language of Christian nationalism, and I think it's helpful for defining that mushy, sentimental part of the spectrum. But I'm increasingly moving towards using the terminology of Christian supremacy for that hardened core. And I'm defining that as Christians who believe that Christians, by dint of being Christians, are superior to other people, and that they should be able to exert a coercive influence over society. And that's not 50%, that's not 45%, that's a much smaller portion of American politics. But part of the problem is that is becoming more and more mainstream within our politics. More and more of these Christian supremacist sentiments are being articulated in our public sphere. So you had Michael Flynn about a year ago say that the US has one nation under God, and so we should be one religion under God. You have Lauren Boebert, Congresswoman from Colorado, saying the government doesn't get to tell the church what to do, the church should tell the government what to do, right? Those are Christian supremacist sentiments. And so that as that becomes more and more mainstream, as more and more acceptable in our public sphere, then you're going to have that mushy middle, right? The Christian nationalist sentimental folks voting with that, or at least voting in coalition with that. And that's one of the dynamics that we really see happening. One last point, and because I think Sam helpfully pointed to the current election. Once you know who these leaders are, once you know how they operate, you can actually track who the politicians are that they're excited about, who the kind of rising Christian supremacist politicians are, who are the next gen Marjorie Taylor Greenes and Lauren Boeberts. They're very excited about Doug Mastriano, the Republican Pennsylvania governor candidate, who's actually a disciple of the New Apostolic Reformation, was mentored by a number of these apostles and prophets very directly. They're very excited about Carrie Lake, the Republican candidate for governor in Arizona, and they're very excited about Mark Finchem, who is the Secretary of State Republican candidate in Arizona, and these are swing states, right, that will control have a very important influence over what happens in the 2024 election, particularly if there is continued election denialism and conflict over election integrity, all these questions. And so I think we do need to learn who the leaders are that we need to be watching within this space and really try to track them and maybe try to find a way of driving a wedge between this more hardened core of Christian supremacist folks and then this more kind of vague and sentimental Christian nationalist coalition.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. Dr. Hussein?
Thanks, Kate. Just a couple of quick observations. I know we're might have some more time for conversation here. It's a privilege to be here with Professor Skorsky and Perry. The flag and the cross book is just so powerful. And then I've had the privilege of reading an advanced copy of Dr. Taylor's book on sort of Salafi Muslims and evangelical Christians. I think there's some really interesting connections there. So I was trained both as a scholar of Islam, but also in early Christianity. And Matthew, when you were talking, it made me think of one of my favorite lines. This will sound funny coming from a Muslim. One of my favorite lines from the New Testament is Paul's letter to the Ephesians 6:12, where he talks about we struggle not against princes, we struggle against principalities and powers, spiritual wickedness in high places. So that's a question of, is that line actually being used? Because we talk about the use of the Bible for a certain segment of evangelical Christians there. So that part. But my mentor, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, was this phenomenal sort of scholar of Islam, but also comparative theology. And somewhere he's got this essay called Christian Noun or Adjective, which I love. Like, are you talking about the noun to be a Christian? Or are you talking about the adjective? Like, how are you behaving as Christians are supposed to behave? And that's where you get this really interesting thing of what's happening with the behavior of folks, and how is that seen by folks who aren't Christian, who recognize the history of this country as multi-religious. You look at that First Amendment that comes out of the Virginia Statute on religious freedom. You look at Mr. Jefferson's autobiography talking about, religious freedom wasn't just for different kinds of Christians. It wasn't just, can Baptists and Episcopalians or, Anglicans at that point have religious freedom? Should Catholics be outside of Maryland or something like that? It was about other religious Christians as well. Mr. Jefferson wasn't aware of the Muslims that he had as slaves. Denise Stolberg's book, Thomas Jefferson's Quran, is just this magnificent sort of book looking at, the founding fathers and particularly the connection with Islam. So I think that's really, really important. The other thing I want to say here, and I'll just throw this out there's this great line from, and I'm picking it up here, Wilfred's Patterns of Faith Around the World. It was a redoing of his The Faith of Other Men, and it's I'm teaching a comparative theology class. We've been using this book in class the last little bit, and he talks about the changing history here. And I think this is what I want to get at and be able to say, that I think this phenomenon is relatively new. What I mean by that is that connection of the political with the religious. And he says this, I'm quoting now from Wilfred Cantwell Smith. I've often been struck by the fact that Western culture has two fundamental sources from which it is never entirely fused, one from Greece and Rome, one from Palestine. These two traditions sometimes in conflict, sometimes in harmony, sometimes one has tended to dominate, sometimes the other, often the two have intertwined, but they have never coalesced. And here's the key part here. Westerners each have two loyalties, one to their religious faith, the other to their secular heritage, with all its range from politics and law to grammar. In the Western world, accordingly, what the West calls religion is seen as one factor in total civilization. In this matter, Western culture is unusual. In some cases, one might almost say that Westerners have two faiths, their religious faith and a faith in democracy or the national side or even their civilization itself. And he goes on to contrast that and says, the case is very different for Muslims. The case is very different for people in India. You see that with sort of, what we would talk about like as Hindu nationalism, not just in India, but here. The case is very different in China, where the religion and the political have always been entwined. And so to me as a outsider, meaning non-Christian, it seems like this really interesting shift where this thing of here's my religious identity and here's my political identity are now like this, and the real interesting kinds of ways in which all three of you have teased that work out, I think is really phenomenal. So let me just stop there and we can have all sorts of things going on in the discussion because there's so much here to talk about. Thank you. Thank
you, Dr. Singh. So I wanted to start with some follow-up questions for myself, and that we've been talking about, and just teasing out some of these higher points. So one of the strong criticisms of work studying white Christian nationalism is that it has constructed clear-cut boundaries that are separating Christian nationalism from Christian patriotism. When I reflect on my own experiences in the US military and now in academia at a Catholic institution, out in the wild, people exist on a spectrum with often a conflation of elements of nationalism and patriotism within their faith identity. So in the spirit of two institutions rooted in dialogue hosting this particular event, what advice do you all have for pastors and educators that are navigating the realities of these blurred boundaries, particularly in communicating and dialoguing with those who are in the gray zone?
I'll just speak to that briefly, and I'd love to hear what my fellow panelists have to say. In the introduction to our book, I mean, we actually we encourage Christian patriotism and say it is a good thing, to the extent that Christian patriotism means Christians supporting the I think founding principles and creeds that unite us as Americans under constitutional democracy. That means full legal equality. That means that we don't say that we commit to the First Amendment, that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Right. So we believe that is a part of what it means to be a Christian patriot. A Christian patriot is defending the Constitution in a way that says, okay, we all have a part in sustaining this democracy together. Where it becomes Christian nationalism is to say that is to either imply or to outright say that America belongs to people like us. That includes Christians, but all that implies often there is other kind of cultural baggage unloaded or uploaded into Christian this language, and that's that's why we call it white Christian nationalism. It often implies white ethnoculture, white traditionalist ethnoculture. Christian means people like us, and that's how it's used politically. That's how it's often implied. We can put this up in surveys as well, and even in experimental designs that we've played around with. So we want to encourage Christian patriotism, and I hope clergy and political leaders together would say, you know what, this Christianity still is a dominant religion in this culture. We want to encourage the kind of patriotism that makes us a home for all of us, and makes us live up to the best part of our faith commitments and our national commitments, not one that makes it an us versus them dichotomy. I'd love to hear my co-panelists on that too.
Just one point that I would make is that Christian nationalism is a grave danger to the Christian witness in the United States. And this can be backed up both historically and empirically. If you're wondering why Christian churches have declined so sharply in many parts of Western Europe, one of the major reasons is precisely the tight embrace between the church, what historians refer to as the alliance of throne and altar, or the alliance between church and state, and forms of Christianity which were imposed coercively on the population. Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America, published nearly a century ago, was one of the first to notice this and one of the first to remark that the remarkable vitality of Christianity in the United States was in large part due to the separation of church and state and the right to religious freedom. This is something that you can also see in contemporary statistical data. One of the main reasons why the nuns, that is the NONES, those people who tell survey researchers that they have no religious affiliation, one of the things that they often remark on is that they see no difference between conservative politics and conservative religion, and therefore, not being politically conservative, want to have nothing to do with religion, and therefore move away from both at the same time. And this is precisely the same thing that happened in Europe. And so I think that's a very important caveat, for people who imagine that by backing up their religious views with the force of the state, that they will be somehow helping to preserve their faith. The very opposite is the case.
Go ahead, Matthew. I was going to say something, but go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm going to riff a little bit on what Sam and Phil just said. I think, and maybe a little bit on what Amir was saying earlier. I think that we have to recognize how strange the United States is in the way that we think about religion and politics. And as Amir is pointing out, this idea of separating out your religious identity from your national identity or your political identity, that's a very new idea in world history, right? The idea of separation of religion and state, you see how messy and complex that is in American history. I would argue that we did not officially disestablish Christianity from the US until really the 1960s, when you start to have the Supreme Court taking prayer out of public schools, right? It was kind of the de facto religion of America. 95% of Americans in the 1950s identified as either Protestant, Catholic, or Jewish. And that's where you start to get this Judeo-Christian rebranding of the long legacy of Christian nationalism. So this is all within the lifetimes of some of the people on this call, right, is where you really have had this cultural shift. And you start to see with also in the 1960s and 1965, the Hart-Celler Immigration Act, and you start to have more religious diversity. You start to see the decline of American Protestantism and the growing category of NONES, nuns, people who mark none of the above on the survey when they're asked what their religious affiliation is. So we're undergoing these tectonic shifts within American culture, within American life, where we really do have a more secular culture today. We really do have a more disestablished Christian church. And there's a lot of people reacting against that. And so to Kate's point about how do we dialogue with people, I think we need to recognize that level of change, that level of transformation is very difficult for people, especially people who have been used to being in power, right? White Christians who've been used to being in power. I grew up going to an evangelical Christian elementary school where I was basically taught Christian nationalism as our history curriculum. And that seemed perfectly reasonable within that community. It seemed, I didn't know anybody who would have disagreed with that. I didn't know anybody who wouldn't have voted Republican. Right. And so we still have a culture where people can exist in these sort of enclaves and feel detached from these broader cultural shifts or feel like those are threatening to them. One of the things that worries me about Christian supremacist or New Apostolic Reformation, kind of these formulations of Christians taking over, is they have a tendency to demonize their opponents and to say those people are just awful, they're evil, and they're even literally possessed by demons, and so we need to take over and exorcise those demons because those people are irrational and we can't reckon with them at all, right? I think those of us who want to stand against Christian nationalism, stand against Christian supremacy, need to avoid doing the kind of parallel move of saying, oh, these Christian nationalists are just irrational, they're horrible, they're terrible people, and they're dehumanizing them and then trying to mobilize against them. I think part of the goal is to recognize that what we're talking about is a very human phenomenon, a very reasonable phenomenon from people coming from a certain perspective. And the challenge is that people who are Christians don't feel particularly threatened by these narratives of Christian supremacy and Christian nationalism. They feel like, oh, well, it keeps me in power, right? And so the more we can facilitate interreligious friendship, the more that they can have Muslim friends who are threatened by this, the more they can have Jewish friends or atheist friends who are threatened by this, the more they can start to say, oh, maybe I'm not so on board with this kind of Christian supremacist narrative.
Just one quick thing here, and okay, we want to move on here, but it goes back to the point you started with about patriotism, and I think about myself, as a Canadian, not as a Muslim. I became an American citizen 9 years ago, and when that happened, I swore an oath to defend the Constitution. For me, it's exactly. I think Matt, you were talking about this. It's the Constitution that's key here. Kate, when you joined the Navy, you swore an oath to defend the Constitution, and I think how many Americans actually have made that oath if you just happen to be born here? Do you learn that history? Do you understand it? And I think about Canada, where we have socialized medicine, which most Canadians, by the way, think is a very good thing. I don't know why some Americans don't think it's a good thing, but that's my own political take. But we have it because of a Christian, Tommy Douglas, who came out of the social gospel movement and believed his reading of Matthew 25:31-46, the parable of the great banquet, that this is taking care of his neighbor, that it was his Christian duty to take care of his neighbor, not his neighborly duty, but his Christian duty. And so you see those kinds of things, which I think are really quite interesting and perhaps a little bit different, where you have all sorts of folks from different churches saying, oh yeah, this is a great idea. Taking care of our neighbor. I can buy into that. As a Muslim, what's the line I wish was in the Quran? Well, Matthew 25, 31 to 46. Do you take care of your neighbor? Do you feed the hungry? Do you clothe the naked? That's the society that I want to help build. The Constitution. That's for all of its issues. It's an amazing document. And the fact that, I'm coming from Canada, not from a war-torn country, not from a country where there's famine or like that, but say, hey, this ideal, that speaks to me. And that speaks to so many immigrants who come from, different places with different religious traditions as well.
Thank you very much for highlighting that, the virtue elements to be found within the understanding of the citizen being shaped by their religious identity and upholding these concepts of the Constitution. I want to shift gears and ask a question. So in Flag and the Cross, white Christian nationalism is a form of what is often called ethno-nationalism, where national belonging is defined in terms of race, religion, and native birth. I want to explore more about the white aspect of Christian nationalism. What is religion's role in shaping this racial ethnic identity? And how should white identity be addressed by Christianity in the US?
I'll jump on that real quick. I mean, I think there's a long historical element to this, but I think there is demonstrably a connection between race and religion in the United States, not only in terms of how Americans sort themselves. I think the segregation of religious communities is not just a religious segregation, but it is also a racial and ethnic segregation. And I think with that, there becomes an implied sense of who are the people like me. In my sociology religion classes every semester, I have my students close their eyes and I tell them to imagine somebody who is Hindu, and I tell them to imagine somebody who is Buddhist, and somebody who is Muslim, and somebody who is Southern Baptist, and invariably they acknowledge that they pictured a raced face. They had pictured somebody from a certain part of the world or somebody from a certain region. That isn't because of hatred, that's just because of the associations that we make in our minds. And so what we find in almost every data set that we have ever collected data on this phenomenon, we find that white Americans, when they hear the language of Christian nationalism, Christian values, Christian nation, Christian heritage, they tend to associate that with their own sense of place in the country. It is not about just Christian power in the nation that is declining. It is about white ethnic power. I'll give you just an example. I was looking at this just yesterday, in fact, and I posted this on Twitter. I was looking at some Pew data, and I'm looking at it right now. In fact, on behind this computer, and it was data that has just been collected a summer ago. But it asked Americans about whether or not they felt like the percentage of the proportion of the country that is white declining is a bad thing, very bad thing, for society. And it also asked about kind of Christian nationalist values. And unsurprisingly to me, I expected to find this, is that the more white Americans believe that the decline of white people in the country as a proportion of the population is a bad thing, the more they support Christian nationalism. Why? Well, it's because Christian nationalism is in many ways, once you understand that there's a racial and ethnic component to our religious understandings, you can see how Christian nationalism, the desire for the nation, for the government, to enforce our own religious values or traditions, is not just about religion, but it's also about my kind of people, my kind of nation, the kind of nation that is set up for people like me. And so there's a long history there, and I'd love to hear other people elaborate on that. But I just say it is demonstrably connected that for white Americans in particular, not necessarily for other Americans who don't connect their national identity and their religion with their race in that way, but for white Americans, to be a Christian oftentimes implies more than just Christianity. It implies ethnic identity.
I mean, as I mentioned, I'm working with a very different data set than Samuel and Philip. And so maybe to nuance things a little bit, from my perspective, I think their data is solid when you're looking at a population-wide scale, right? I'm looking at this very narrow data set of, in the number of hundreds of leaders who are very influential in a particular world. This independent charismatic world that I would argue is driving a lot of the Christian nationalist sentiment is actually pretty multi-ethnic. And even the leadership cast of it is pretty multi-ethnic. And so you have a leader like one of the people that I have interviewed and looked at is a pastor from Pasadena named Che On. He's Korean American. He actually immigrated to the US as a child. And he speaks at one of the rallies leading up to the Capitol riot on January 5th. And he gets up and he gives this quite Christian nationalist, Christian supremacist speech about we are going to rule and reign through Donald Trump in Jesus Christ for the next 8 years, and America is going to become a Christian country, and it's on some level that's disorienting, right? If we're thinking purely in terms of race, I think the reality is that race and religion are overlaid in very complicated ways in the U.S. And so I would argue you could think of it like a Venn diagram, right? Most people who are Christian supremacists are also white supremacists, right? Those are two circles that overlap greatly. Not all white supremacists are Christian, though, right? There are atheists who are white supremacists, and not all Christian supremacists are white. Right? There are people who prioritize that religion layer of their identity more than the racial or ethnic layer of their identity, and are willing to be maybe even in coalition with white supremacists or white Christian nationalists if they feel like their Christian identity is being protected. So I think the reality is those politics are very complicated, and those narratives are very complicated. But again, I'm not questioning the kind of population-wide data. I think this is largely a white issue. Most people who are white supremacists or would believe in white supremacy in the sense of white being normative are also Christian supremacists. But there are margins that we also need to pay attention to.
Let me just follow up on this point, which is a very good one, with a slightly different metaphor, which is a musical one instead of a mathematical one. I think one of the things that makes white Christian nationalism so powerfully resonant for so many different sorts of people is that you can highlight one note or another in this chord, if you will. So let's say you're not white, just play the Christian or the native-born notes really loud. Or if you're not Christian, just play the white note and the nationalist note really loud, and then it won't really matter that you're not the other thing, or in fact, it might serve as a kind of a substitute for the other thing that you're not. And so, but I think this is a very powerful point to emphasize that they're white nationalists, non-white Christian nationalists, white Christians who are not particularly nationalistic, all can be pulled in, into harmony, as it were, through this chord of white Christian nationalism. It just, one other point, amplifying something you said earlier, Matt, that I think is a very important point to underline, because it's a common and I think somewhat erroneous objection that you hear. It's like, well, this is just a small group of people. It's nowhere near 50%. This, I think, just reflects a fundamentally erroneous understanding about how politics works, particularly how authoritarian movements work. You don't need to be an electoral majority. You just need to be a well-organized, well-armed, highly mobilized minority. And so the fact that the really extreme white Christian supremacists might only be 15%, that of that, maybe only another 10 or 15% are really prepared to engage in political violence, gives me absolutely no comfort. And so I think this is where your other point about it's so important, that folks within various communities of faith really, step back, reflect on this, and are willing to just to say no, and to sort of challenge folks and administer to folks who've been swept up in this ideology, which, and here I will sound a little bit theological, I think is, idolatrous, heterodox, heretical. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox.
Okay, I'm going to shift over to some questions from the audience. Bringing two questions together. What is the appeal of the hatred and the violence that's espoused by white Christian nationalists or Christian supremacists? What do Christian nationalists say when they speak on the teachings of Jesus? Kind of the paradox that exists between those two.
So I guess since I'm immersed in the fever swamps of this stuff on a daily basis, I'll speak to that a little bit. These folks are very comfortable quoting Jesus. They're very theologically literate. I think there's often an impression that leaders in these types of movements, or maybe participants in these types of movements, aren't really Christian, or don't really know their Bible. And to that, I would say they probably know their Bible better than most of our audience members. They are very focused on reading the Bible. They are good evangelicals in that sense, right? They're very literate in Scripture. They tend to emphasize the passages of Jesus that are often marginalized in other interpretive traditions, right? Most interpretive traditions around Jesus focus on his death, focus on his sacrificial life. These folks are very interested in the supernatural elements of the life of Jesus, where he is healing, where he's transforming people around him. One of the favorite verses in this kind of spiritual warfare world, and this was on everyone's lips and in everyone's social media pages leading up to January 6th, is a passage from Matthew chapter 11, verse 12, where Jesus says, "Since the days of John the Baptist, his cousin, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force." That's an actual thing that Jesus said, right? The violent take the kingdom of heaven by force. Now, there's a lot of debate within the Christian tradition about what that means and how do we think about that, but they see it as a mandate to do spiritual violence. And they would separate out spiritual violence from physical violence. We need to do violence against the demons that have taken over our country, do violence against these principalities and powers that Amir referenced coming out of Ephesians chapter 6. But that rhetoric of violence, that comfort with violence, that comfort with, I can hate the demons, right? That doesn't work really well in a pluralist democracy, right? If you imagine that anyone who disagrees with you, the reason they disagree with you is A, they're not a Christian, and B, they're possessed by demons, it's very hard to negotiate with someone that you assume is possessed by demons. You either have to conquer them or exorcise those demons. And so this is what I think has been one of the major factors in coarsening our national political rhetoric, is this, to use the term that Philip used earlier, this Manichaean imagination that some of us are good and some of us are evil, and that the good ones need to drive out the evil from the evil ones.
Yeah, it really is. And just following up on that, I think we all pick and choose, from our scriptures. We have these scriptural traditions that are incredibly rich. And just without getting into my own story, I first came to the Bible through the study of English literature, particularly William Blake. And then the first book in the Bible that I ever read was the book Revelation. The image of Jesus in Revelation 19, very different than the image of Jesus in Matthew 25. And I think it's exactly that. These are folks who are picking up on Bible verses. They may not be the Bible verses we're picking up on. They may not be the same of Jesus that we have, but you certainly can also say, here's where this comes from. Here's the lines, here's the quotations, of things, and they would be the first one to say, this is not out of hate, this is out of love. You hate the evil, you love the person, and you're trying to do that. Which causes, of course, all sorts of issues.
Just to amplify these points, which I think are really, really important ones. Two important trends that I've noticed, one big, one small. The big trend, and Matthew, I think, can back me up on this, is that particularly amongst Pentecostals, but not only amongst Pentecostals, there has been a movement to a new understanding of the end times, in which Christians must first take dominion, must first establish the kingdom before the second coming. So it's a kind of a blending together of traditional premillennial dispensational teachings with a certain kind of a rereading of older post-millennial understandings. But the key point here is that Christians are called to force the end. They are called to take dominion. They are not simply waiting for Jesus to return. They have an active role to play in bringing about his return in politics, but across all spheres of society. I think that this point about the Manichaeism is, again, another one that bears underlining. The way I put this sometimes is that this is the view that the line between good and evil does not run with it through people, but between people, right? That, we're not, wrestling with evil within, as St. Augustine would say, but that we are wrestling, with the principalities and powers outside of us. And one way in which I think these lines have become blurred, the lines between peoples and institutions, language that I've seen increasingly recently, including in a statement by the Family Research Council that Michelle Bachmann was a part of, is simply referring to the enemy, capital E. Now, I mean, this is, of course, a way in which you can talk about Satan, and that's the illusion, but within this understanding of the world, that encompasses all of your political, religious, spiritual, maybe even personal enemies, right, are all somehow in league or part of this single overarching force of evil. And that again is the kind of rhetoric which certainly leads to spiritual warfare, and I think for a small minority, but an important minority, prepares the way for physical violence as well.
Yeah, just very quickly, I could just spend the next hour on the shifts that are going on within evangelical eschatology, the theology of the end times. But the shift is largely around, in the 20th century, evangelicals had a very pessimistic view of the end of the world. They believed that Christians were just things were going to get worse and worse in society, and then Jesus was going to come back, rapture everyone away, and fix the world. The shift has been the growth of what they would call a victorious eschatology. That again is blending in other elements from other traditions, but this idea that the church should battle through that. The church shouldn't just huddle. The church should try to take over as much of society as possible. And they even, Amir, I hate to disabuse you, but they even quote Matthew chapter 25. There are sheep nations and there are goat nations, right? And sheep nations that go into eternal glory and goat nations that go into eternal damnation. And we should do our best to make America a sheep nation, by which they mean take it over for Jesus, right? So this utilization of scripture is very rampant and very problematic, but there are these major shifts going on within the way that people, evangelical Christians, especially these independent charismatic folks, understand the end of the world.
Just a footnote, that doesn't mean we should all become sheeple, though, I guess, right?
So a final question. One critique of sociological work of Whitehead, Perry, etc., is that they clump into the category all WCNs as all those Christians on the right who simply are trying to live out their faith, have a say in what their children are taught, advocate for the rights of the unborn, etc. Should all attempts of Christians on the right to bring their faith to bear on politics be dismissed as Christian nationalism? Should they be lumped together with non-religious folks who use Christian nationalism as an identity? How can we operationalize dialogue rather than the we, them othering?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot there. Let me try to jump on that one. So, yeah, I think we try to say on the outset of actually both of those books. So, and Taking America Back for God and The Flag and the Cross, we try to make it clear that we are not talking about all Christians, not even talking about all Christians voting their values. We've never said that. And like Phil said at the beginning of our conversation, like it is unfortunate that as the conversation around Christian nationalism has taken off, I think it is. I'm sure it has happened lots of times where people have just called Christian nationalism anything on the right that they feel like is conservative or reflects Christian values. That's not what we've sought to do. I think there is. We try to define it clearly so that we're talking about something where we're talking about institutionalizing a particular kind of ethnoculture and forcing that in through politics. And so, yeah, absolutely. We call for, at the end of our book, The Flag and the Cross, we call for a coalition of everybody from Never Trump evangelicals all the way to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Like it is going to be people, Christians and non-Christians, seculars across the board, who are concerned with the direction of liberal democracy, concerned with the threat of the people that Matthew was talking about, like not in a dehumanizing way. I do want to stress that. I think that's really important to acknowledge, and I appreciate him bringing that up. It shouldn't be an us versus them, as long as we can keep it from that, right? Like I want to resist the temptation to just rope this into our polarized discourse and to say us versus them immediately. And if you're on this side of the aisle, then that's we can't cooperate. It actually is going to take something like that. It'll take coalitions of people who are concerned with democracy, who are concerned with making sure that everybody has rights, and is concerned about the direction of this kind of language, the Christian nationalist political movement. But we want to make sure that we do not alienate unnecessarily people who are Christians, who are just trying to raise their children with the kind of values that they would want to raise them with, assuming that is not this kind of like hardline Christian nationalist ideology. Yeah.
Sorry, I know we're running out of time here, but just following up on what Professor Perry said, I think that's the difference between the really good scholarship, the kind of work that Professors Perry and Gorski and Taylor do, where you're very clear and careful. I'm saying this about this group, not about that group. I understand this group is different from this group and that kind of thing. The other part in this dovetails what Professor Perry was saying was that, if we look at other religious traditions, oftentimes you may find the same level of conservatism. If you look at, generally speaking, the American Muslim community, the American Hindu community, we tend to be much more sort of conservative, socially conservative on gender roles, on sexuality, around issues around abortion, things like that. And so this really interesting kind of thing, like, you might have some allies over here. If what you want to do is do X, you might actually have some allies on this side, not of the political aisle, but of the religious aisle there. And I think that's where it becomes really sort of quite problematic sometimes, where it becomes this either or, like my tribe. And I think that's that real problem that a lot of us have, the difference between, my country, right or wrong, and wait, what's the ideal of my country? And am I concerned in the direction that my country is going in? That's right.
Yeah, I think the more that we can do to champion a lot of forms of patriotism, Muslim patriotism, Jewish patriotism, atheist patriotism, all kind of built around our commitment to the Constitution and really our commitment to pluralism, right? The ability for people to inhabit a lot of different identities and ideas and spaces, and then we can all kind of be together in that, holding on to our particularities, but also being different and being united. Because we're out of time, I'll just note that we're going to drop a survey in the chat. Please fill that out. It'll give us all some feedback about this event, and we will really listen to that and pay attention to that. We really appreciate your time. And just on behalf of the ICJS, I am very grateful for the panel, for Kate, and for our partners at Catholic University of America. Thank you all so much for participating and for joining us today.